Welcome, everyone. I'm Eugen Ko. I'm the chair of the Center for Spirituality of Care and Community, and may I welcome you warmly to the fourth Roy Bradley Oration. Before we begin formally, I would like to bring to your attention some housekeeping matters. We will soon begin with acknowledgements and introduction, and our speaker today, Linda Walter, will speak for 50 minutes. We will then have 30 minutes of response and questions. Bernadette Wardlow, a member of our committee, will be our respondent today. Please respond as you wish throughout the session in the Q&A section, which is activated by the button on the bottom bar of your screen. Jill Bradley, whom you have communication from, will moderate your questions and read them out for Linda to reply. At CSCC, we begin all our meetings with acknowledgements, starting with our acknowledgement of country. Most of us meeting in Australia are meeting on the land of the Kulin Nation, and those of us in Melbourne are on the land of the Wurundjeri people. The First Nations people were robbed of their land. They fought back and many were killed. Many women and children died of violent deaths. Gradually, they were dispossessed of their country and their culture. I would like to invite you to join me in acknowledging their pain and suffering of these many years and continuing. Margaret Bradley, at one of our committee meetings, acknowledged that they have many painful stories to tell, and we need to have the courage to listen deeply. Margaret Bradley passed away only a few weeks ago. Margaret was a founding committee member of CSCC, but she was much more than that. She, together with Roy, was the inspiration for the creation of CSCC, in particular the inclusion of community as its focus. Margaret was among the first to support the idea of the Roy Bradley Oration to honour Roy's life and work in the creation of CSCC. As a committee, we have noted that these past couple of years have been particularly difficult for Margaret, with bouts of illnesses and isolation during the lockdown. We've always been thrilled, however, whenever she bounced back and contributed to our monthly committee meetings. She did so again earlier this year, and in her strong and quiet way, she suggested Linda Walter to deliver the Roy Bradley Oration this year. Sadly, she will miss it. Perhaps she knew something about our need for the courage to grieve. Friends, we are now living in one of the most turbulent times of conflict and pandemic, of global upheavals, change and loss, and uncertainties. At such a time, we need to be reminded about what is important and what grounds us, and what we can hold on to. At our first oration, Bruce Rumpel reminded us of the importance of compassionate communities. At our second, Tim Costello highlighted the importance of ethics in leadership and sacrifice. And last year, Rachel Kahn pointed to our need to apprehend awe and mystery. This year, we are very pleased that Linda Walter accepted our invitation to deliver the fourth Roy Bradley Oration. I have known Linda since we worked together at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre some 30 years ago. She was in pastoral care, and I was drawn to her warmth and gentle wisdom, and I was interested in her healthy grieving groups for nurses. Linda has worked in nursing, hospital chaplaincy, bereavement counselling, psychotherapy, and spiritual direction. While a pastoral counsellor at Peter MacCallum, she taught postgraduate nurses and medical students. She has conducted bereavement groups and facilitated grieving among health professionals and lectured at the Yarra Theological College on death, grief, and new life, conversations of faith, and led clergy retreats. Linda has been active in the Christian feminist movement and co-authored Women of Spirit, Women's Place in Church and Society in the early 80s. She now enjoys retirement with her husband Nick in Anglesey, and along with family and friends who stay often in what is affectionately called their Bush Mission Hospital. I would like now to invite Linda to deliver the fourth Roy Bradley oration on the strength of kindness and the courage to grieve.
Thank you very much, Eugen. I'm very honoured to be here. We're here today, as Eugen has said, to honour one of our past elders, beloved Roy Bradley, and his wife, Margaret. It could truly be said, I think, that Roy passed on to us in Australia the stories of our Western dreaming, of our faith stories. He helped us to see what deeply matters in our faith, in our kinship and in our responsibilities to keep alive the possibility of what he called the mystery of God and the power of redemptive relationships. Caring for the carers, kindness in desolate times, the courage to grieve, and the place of the feminine, these are the themes of my address. The task I've set myself is to show how all of these things hang together and are actually already known to us. If I can shed some kindly light to help us remember them and take hold of them more consciously, I will have served you well. Bringing these things to mind, moment by moment, does light a path to lead us in this present darkness. These things will not magically solve our problems, but they will strengthen our courage to stay the distance, to stay it truly, to stay it together. They will furnish what we need to ask for ourselves and for those we care for. Our 6-year-old granddaughter, Mina, asked me recently, "Gran, why do you go to church? What do you do there?" Me, well, first we turn our phones off. We be quiet. We listen to Bible stories. We think about the stories together and we try to work out what they mean. We sing. We put our hands out for a bit of bread. We ask God to keep showing us what really matters and to help us to live this way. Mina, but if you already know what matters, Gran, why do you keep going? Me, because it's too easy to forget. So what does really matter? The strength of kindness is the place where I want to begin. I want to think more deeply about what kindness is, what it looks like, what it doesn't look like. What is the strength of kindness? How is it strong? Where do we see this strength actually happening around us, between us, within us, in our current situations? And what is the damage of unkindness? Mark Twain defined kindness as the language that the deaf can hear and the blind can see. The Dalai Lama said, "This is my simple religion. There's no need for temples, no need for complicated philosophy. Our brain, our own heart is our temple. The philosophy is kindness. St. Paul, in his letters to the struggling early churches, was at pains to stress kindness. Be kind to one another, he wrote, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God forgives you. Put on then, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. It's been suggested that the entire opus of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets is, in fact, a wonderful study in kindness. Charles Darwin believed humankind to be a profoundly social and caring species. He argued that sympathy and caring for others is instinctual. Jacinta Ardern's words to all New Zealanders as the threat of COVID arrived on New Zealand's shores were, be strong and be kind. Words spoken by a leader who had already inspired with her acts of kindness after the Christchurch mosque tragedy across creeds and cultures and nations. Angela Merkel, as Germany's first woman chancellor, pioneered a particular way of kindness in her role as chancellor and as head of the EU. It earned her the name of Mutti. Her request to pay a state visit to Israel understandably created at first an outraged uproar. But when Angela Merkel was finally invited to address the Knesset, Israel's parliament, her behaviour was so genuinely humble, her shame and grief at Germany's unspeakable crimes so obvious, her words spoken in Hebrew so sensitively kind, that she received a standing ovation. In this visit to Israel, Mutti became, for that brief moment, also Ima, a tender, healing image of motherly servant leadership across a traumatic divide. Closer to home, the head of pastoral care at Royal Melbourne Hospital, David Glenister, told me recently that before appointing their new CEO, the hospital board surveyed all staff to find out what mattered most to them. Their answers have led to a change in the hospital's new mission statement. Put people first. Start from a place of kindness. True excellence is achieved together. An insight about kindness from Bruce Rumbold is quite helpful here, I think. He says, those who recognise the highly conditional way in which we speak of compassion as a healthcare value suggest that it is more realistic to replace the lofty goal of compassion with simple kindness and respect. Simple kindness and respect is exactly how David and his colleagues welcomed me, a total stranger, when I knocked unannounced on his office door that day to get some sense of Melbourne's public hospital scene before I began to try and write this oration. I felt I'd been out of the scene for rather a long time. Back then, in the 90s, in my role of bereavement counsellor, I was once asked to see a woman in her 60s. As a child, Ruth had survived the Holocaust, but until now, she had been unable to speak about it. She asked if we might meet for a few times before deciding whether or not to continue. In our reviewing conversation, I confessed to Ruth my sense of inadequacy in the face of the enormity of her life's sorrows. Ruth brushed this away, saying sternly, "You don't understand, Linda. the way you open the door to me when I arrive, and the way you farewell me at the gate. This is healing me. A friend who is pastoral supervisor of aged care chaplains working across widely scattered centres tells me how these COVID years have taught him above all the importance of finding the right place to meet with each particular chaplain, the space where they will know they are truly seen in their desperation. He is prepared to travel long distances to do this. Otherwise, he says, the chaplains can feel they are drowning in people and yet utterly alone. I try to model who God is by going to where they are. We both know the situation's really hard and that supervision's not going to solve it. But I've learnt the strength of such kindly pastoral supervision actually does help the chaplains to find and honour a tender resilience in themselves. This in turn gives them the courage to stay the distance in their work. I want to read you now a poem called Kindness by Arab-American poet Naomi Shihab Nye. I think it puts flesh on all these glimpses. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand that you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you. How he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore, that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. Can we say then that a timely act of kindness is in itself living proof of the goodness of the world? That simply to be held in mind can be the greatest kindness of all. Does the strength of kindness enable us to love and forgive ourselves and each other for our unkindnesses? Can the strength of courage put new heart in us, literally encourage us? And importantly, in these times of desolation from tragedies of one sort or another, can the strength of kindness provide an adequate sense of safety for the genuine expression of our sorrows? I believe it can. Ignatius of Loyola learnt the hard way that we should always look at the desolation in the light of the consolation. I take this to mean that we need to steady our feet on some good ground, even if it's only a tiny patch, before daring to look at the desolation. The consolations of kindness matter. Kindness towards others and kindness towards myself. This matters. And so I invite each of you now to call to mind a recent experience of perhaps unexpected kindness that has helped you to stay the distance, something on which you could stand. And I invite you to let it be your consolation, to use Ignatius's word, as we turn now to think about the courage to grieve in the context of this present time of desolation. And so we come to the second half, the courage to grieve. Denise Levertov, one of my favourite poets, puts it perfectly. To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. To speak about the courage to grieve, then, I will draw on my own work as pastoral counsellor at Peter MacCallum, way back in the 1980s and early 90s. The then head of social work and I set up and ran for some years a successful bereavement support group. Many times throughout this period, I saw something unexpected happen in those bereavement support group sessions, for which at the time I had no language. A potted history of the literature of bereavement counselling is perhaps worthwhile here. Because death, loss and grief are fundamental human experiences, a wealth of knowledge has been accumulated. There's traditional knowledge gathered in all cultures. There's the subjective knowledge of direct personal experience. There's the knowledge of those who've been willing to think deeply about their own individual and about collective experiences, and about what, if anything, may be any use to people who grieve. As Elizabeth Kubler-Ross found in 1969, with her groundbreaking on death and dying, the world, or at least the so-called developed world, loves a neatly numbered schema. In those early days of bringing death and dying out of the cupboard, some grabbed at her 5-stage schema and applied it, almost, I thought sometimes, like a splint or a course of antibiotics. Death had been so repressed from the conscious life of our society, and particularly from the language of modern Western medicine, that the effect of Kubler-Ross's work was for many an enormous relief. In 1973, Ernst Becker's masterpiece, The Denial of Death, was published. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Reviewing Becker's book, Kubler-Ross wrote, "It puts together what others have torn to pieces and rendered useless." Becker's philosophy consists of 4 strands. The first strand is the world is terrifying. The second strand is the underlying motivation for human behaviour is our need to control our basic anxiety and deny the terror of death. The third strand is we conspire not to be conscious of the way things really are. And the fourth strand, he said, is by denying the harsh facts of life and by our desire for safety from pain at all costs, we actually make ourselves less, not more, capable of loving. One thing this does mean, surely, is that the instinct to avoid as much pain as possible is normal, that all life naturally resists suffering. We all do it. So the crux of our question is, what do we do with the pain that we cannot avoid? What do we do with our own losses and griefs when they stop us in our tracks? So, right here, right now, what exactly are we grieving? How are we grieving? How am I grieving? How are you grieving? Is it alike or different for each of us? Is it individual or communal? We will only know when we stop and truly listen. Listen to all the big and small incremental losses and wounds and deaths of these heartbreakingly difficult COVID years. Listen to the words of loving grief spoken in the past month when two public figures, beloved by many, died. Across the world, Queen Elizabeth's death was deeply felt. Closer to home, Jack Charles's death was too. Did you notice how remarkably similar were the words spoken by ordinary people in the street in their gratitude for what they called the simple kindness that characterized these two vastly different lives? More recently still, within this close-knit community of St. Philip's, we listened to ordinary and extraordinary stories honouring the life of beloved Margaret Bradley, the strength of kindness personified, as someone said in the eulogies, as she was farewelled and laid to rest with great honour and joyful tenderness. Listen also to our grief at the loss of the things that in normal times make our society live: the arts, live music, hospitality, the freedom to move. Listen to the environmental losses and the climate change terrors. Listen to the statement from the heart. Listen to the cries of asylum seekers. Listen to the cries from the LGBTQI+ community. These are only some of our contemporary griefs. Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto these sorrows. And underlying these, for those who work as carers of one kind or another, we are grieving a moral injury incurred by a health system ill-prepared for what has overtaken the world, and by a vacuum of moral leadership in our own nation's life. What do we mean by moral injury? It is a term coined in the wake of the Vietnam War by psychologist Jonathan Shea. It has been taken up recently to describe the feeling that one's character and very being have been diminished by our elected governments in their inhumane policies and by their failures to act humanely. Listen to these words in a recent article in the Saturday paper. It's entitled Critical Conditions. Without being prompted, every single healthcare professional who spoke with TSP, the Saturday paper, for this story, mentioned the concept of moral injury, or the trauma caused by being unable to care for patients. If you put someone who really cares in a system where they're forced to say no, or they're forced to ignore people's needs because they can't actually provide what's required, then they either harden up, or they get miserable, or they leave. So says Dr. Claire Skinner, President of the Australasian College for Emergency Medicine. What is to be done to address such moral injury? No wonder we need to plant our feet on some good, steady ground before we dare to approach. The courage to grieve may not seem very easy to find, and yet it is there, and it is within our reach. I always recall with gratitude John Paver's words to me when, as head of pastoral care at Peter Mac, he asked me to take up this bereavement counselling work. It's simple, really, Linda, he said. Grieving people need to talk, and not many people are prepared to listen. Shakespeare agrees with John Paver. He says, give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak knits up the overwrought heart and bids it break. The most helpful working text for these bereavement support groups we found to be Warden's Grief Counselling and Grief Therapy. William Warden drew heavily on the work of John Bowlby and his attachment theory. I particularly appreciated Warden's obvious respect for those grieving people who, in their willingness to share with him their pain, he knew had been his very best teachers. Without such a stance of humility, I believe it's dangerous to speak of professionalism in the realm of bereavement support. Warden's 4 tasks of mourning mirror closely the 4 strands of Ernst Becker's philosophy. First, accept the fact of the loss. Second, experience the pain of grief. 3, adjust to an environment in which the beloved person or place or thing is no longer. And 4, lay hold of life again and dare to love again. Ernst Becker suggested that human lives are lived, have always been lived in what he called a rhythm of sorrow. Can we see that finding this rhythm together and daring to learn to speak, even to dance and sing to it together, is in fact the challenge of Warden's 4th task of healthy mourning. Over the 8 weeks of each bereavement support group's life, 10 people welcomed one another week by week and then spent 2 hours listening intently to story after story of death through cancer of a beloved friend or relative. In the early months of our work together, the social worker and I would comment on the quality of the listening and the interactions. But in truth, we simply didn't know how to speak of what we were seeing. As time went on, we sensed we were witnessing more than the officially desired outcome of helping people to cope with their grief. And importantly, we were learning and beginning to recognise a shape, that there was a need to go down into grief before there could be any recovery, let alone rising or empowering. This shape we had seen in the literature. It was called a grief curve. I'll talk about that later. But in these groups, we were moved by the depth of what was shared in each group and by the honest expression of raw despair. It rendered us speechless and in awe of something bigger than all of us. Paradoxically, this was not without hope. It was as if the members of the groups were talking their troubled way into a country few had visited before. They too were amazed at what they were finding there. When everyone had gone home, I would sometimes go into St. Francis Church next door to where the groups met and sit in exhausted silence. Poetry and hymns and psalms and lines from the tragedies of Shakespeare would rise unbidden in my mind. I wanted to be able to tell the members of the groups that they knew what the psalmist knew, what the world's greatest playwrights and poets and composers knew. There was nothing little and mean and pathetic about what we heard in those groups. Well, actually, that's not quite true, as you would expect. Of course, there was plenty of anger, as you would hope, really. There was also griping and poor meing and blaming and terrible regrets. But the lasting impression was of something more than this. In later reading, I came across British psychoanalyst and theorist Wilfred Bion, aptly named the psychoanalytic mystic by his biographer. Wilfred Bion's famous, to some infamous, recommendation for the radical openness of the analyst is what he calls an act of faith. He describes the therapist's attitude ideally to be one without memory, without desire, without understanding, without expectation. It would appear that Wilfred Bion knew in his own life the zero states that he spoke of, and he had weathered these states in his own life. Life never lost its relish in a final way. He asked, how can a dead man be alive and an alive man dead? And he believed that such simultaneity is possible, even necessary, that aliveness and disturbance flow from the same source. According to Michael Eigen, Bion grounded psychoanalysis on something deeper than the drive to know. The faith that supports living is at stake, he said. What moves me here is Bion's great spiritual courage, such radical openness for himself, but also on behalf of others, is itself an act of great faith and costly love. Bion exemplifies for me the costly stance of humility, of humbly waiting in the not knowing. He was not a conventionally religious person, but he was compelled by what he experienced as he listened to his patients in his open way to ask the big questions. I shall use the term "O," he wrote, to denote that which is the ultimate reality, absolute truth, the Godhead, the infinite, the thing in itself. You may be wondering why I raise this here. Well, it's because I hope it might help each of us to contemplate a similar leap of courage in our desire to be honest and genuine in our own grieving. It takes real courage to be open to ourselves, as much as it does to share with another trusted person the truth of our despairs and hopes. These words about Bion also provide a helpful link to a story I read in the collection of essays in honour of Roy Bradley. And this story parallels the experience of those original Peter McCallum bereavement support groups. In an essay called The Dark Side, Eugen Coe wrote about his visits to remote Aboriginal communities. He describes how, in one desert mob gathering, the grandmothers spoke courageously in front of 200 Aboriginal artists from art centres across the central and western deserts. Each of them broke down as they finished with the words, "This is my story." Many in the audience broke down too. "That is my story too." Sometimes, perhaps not quite often enough, said Eugen, they want more than understanding. For those who have some notion of God, their traumatic experiences usually include a fracturing of their sense of a loving and caring God, and a dislocation from a way of being that gave them a secure and meaningful existence. They need pastoral care with a strong element of spiritual direction. Art and poetry, drama and music, all are crucial in the search for an integrative path in our finding the courage to grieve. Theories about grief do matter and they do help, yet they can only take us so far. Awareness of art's visual images, poetry's word pictures, music's pulse and movement, the intricate beauties of nature, the imaginative play of children, the wisdom of faiths, all these have transformative power. one picture can be worth 1,000 words. Art can give us a whole to go through, firing the imagination. Ignatius of Loyola considered the imagination to be the place where the contest is lost or won. Yet it takes courage to enter two-way into experiencing and thinking, to honour the imaginative as well as the professional literature and discourse. Benedictine monk Sebastian Moore says this: "The great stories of our faiths are small story transformers. The level of luminous self-awareness is being discovered by people who profess no religious belief. That's the way history works. When the people who ought to be onto something aren't, outsiders get onto it. It can be embarrassing for the believer to be confronted with a non-believer who is in touch with the area where faith grows, whilst the believer is not. Such levels of luminous self-awareness are implicit in the powerful imagery of the artwork of the Aboriginal painters themselves. Yet there is still a need to be helped to recognise this, to be helped to meditate on it, and to validate those unbidden, strange stirrings of new meaning and consolation, which, having touched the deepest core, can bring us alive. Is there anyone to accompany the desert mob grandmothers in this? Elements of luminous self-awareness are also to be found in the art that straddles the two worlds of First Peoples dreaming and of deep Christian faith. Some of you may remember a marvellous NGV exhibition, Modern Art and the Religious Imagination, curated by Rosemary Crumlin in 1998. At the very centre of the exhibition, watched over by Aboriginal elders who had travelled especially from the artists' community in Balgo in Western Australia, this sculpture of Mary of Warman simply took the breath away. Here it is. George Mung Mung's Mary of Warman. The purpose for this sculpture was to make a Mary that would never break, for the old plaster image of Mary had broken when the table was knocked over by the community dogs. The wood for this sculpture was cut by George Mung Mung from a tree deep in the remote Bungle Bungle Ranges in Western Australia. The tools were an old car spring and an ordinary knife. The result is a sculpture that is at once deeply religious and immensely powerful. To create it, George Mung Mung entered into his consciousness two-way. He went down into his Aboriginal roots, into his belief in his ancestor spirits, in his responsibility to maintain right relationships with the land, and into his position as elder in the small community at Turkey Creek, also known as Balgo. But Mung Mung also reflected deeply on his Catholicity, on the meaning of Mary as the mother of Jesus, and on the incarnation. The figure is of a young, unmarried woman girl. Her body is painted with the traditional designs. She's pregnant, and she carries her child in her womb shield beneath her heart. The unborn is already a man who dances within her. George Mung Mung said, "This young woman, she's a young one, this one. The spirit of the little baby comes in a dream to his mother. Proper little one, his mother says. The babe grows and he might be ready by Christmas time. He says, 'Mother, I'm ready now.' And the old women take her away and the little one is born down in the river here. Out of an ancient culture comes the mother. Mung Mung's sculpture is one of 3 pieces of art that have kept me company in my preparation for today's address. Actually, it's felt like the artworks chose me and then left me to work out how on earth to include them and in what order. I'm grateful to you, Luke, for bringing them up as I ask for them. The second image I want to show you, but not quite yet. Mung Mung can go away, but in a minute we'll bring up the other one. The second image I want to show you is a bronze bas-relief by New Zealand sculptor Ria Bancroft, which I first saw on the cover of a small book, A Matter of Life and Death, by Bishop John Taylor. The original work lives in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel in Christchurch Catholic Cathedral, New Zealand. In fact, it is the doors of the tabernacle. John Taylor said he had searched the entire Bodleian Library in Oxford, as you do, and he had not found an image of death and resurrection to compare with this. It is a wonderful find. I want to show it to you now because it mirrors surprisingly the shape of a grief curve, with its essential descending before any rising. See how Mary cradles her son's dead body against her own body, lowering him into the grave. See how from there the body is drawn up and pushes through the rock, breaking through the earth. See how the shape of this descending and rising mirrors the grief curve. See how it is all held within the earthy shape of a heart. In workshops with faithful, exhausted AIDS workers in the 1980s, whenever I offered this image, many wept in grateful recognition of an image that honoured their own experience of caring for their beloved patients through the AIDS epidemic. It gave them heart to continue. On the other hand, a close friend of mine, a convinced atheist humanist, some years after the tragic death of his wife, looked at this on my wall and said, I recognise this. On the left-hand side, the body is dragging the mind down. On the right-hand side, the mind is drawing the body up. John Taylor suggests we would never have known this pattern if Jesus had not died and risen, but that once we have seen it here and seen it there in that story and in all the artwork of our faith, once we've seen it there, we may recognise it elsewhere. So the shape of the grief curve may be surprisingly discovered in other places too. For me, I found it in the story of Luke's Gospel of the walk to Emmaus. The idea of grief being a journey is not a new one. The shape of this Emmaus journey mirrors the grief curve, with the same descending into despair and the same fearlessly attentive listening and the same astonished rising. The walk to Emmaus is the story of a stranger who draws near to 2 troubled disciples as they escape the scene of disaster they've witnessed played out in Jerusalem. The arrest, the beating up, the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus, the innocent one, the one whom they had followed and had dared to believe was the saviour of their world. It's a story of a stranger who walks alongside, who listens with unguarded openness, a stranger who is prepared to keep walking in their direction. This stranger only speaks to inquire what things, and then keeps listening until their speaking has run its course, until he senses the time is right for them to be able to hear something more. When the stranger finally does speak, in loving exasperation, what they hear makes their cold, grieving hearts burn within them, although they won't recognise this until nightfall, when they eventually reach home and they invite the stranger in to share at their table. The stranger breaks bread with them and then he vanishes. But the two travellers now have all they need. They've come alive again and they are ready to return differently to the scene they had fled. As with all the fleeting post-resurrection appearances of Jesus recorded in the Gospels, the astonished witnesses discover in each encounter that something totally new has happened. Something comes alive in themselves, something that means clinging to the old, to the past, doesn't work anymore like it once did. And perhaps this is exactly what Ernst Becker is talking about. For those amongst us today, those who are not religiously inclined, I want to include here a beautiful parallel. It's between Sigmund Freud's way and the way of Jesus. And it's by English-American poet Auden. It's called In Memory of Sigmund Freud, who died September 1939, just as the Second World War was starting. Freud wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude, without an embarrassing, over-familiar gesture. But he wishes us more than this. To be free is often to be lonely. He would give back to the son the mother's richness of feeling. So Auden's poem in turn leads us to my third image. It is Stanley Spencer's The Mother Hen. Stanley Spencer was a stretcher bearer in the First World War, and this is one of a series he did called Christ in the Wilderness. It's inspired by a passage in the Gospels. O Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, how often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. The following prayer is inspired by these same words. It's St. Anselm's prayer. St. Anselm was Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century. I imagine he had more than his share of the depressing political power struggles of his day. I imagine he knew lots about moral injury. And out of this distress, St. Anselm prays to his mother Christ. And you, my soul, dead in yourself, run under the wings of Jesus, your mother, and lament your griefs under his feathers. Ask that your wounds may be healed and that comforted you may live again. Christ, my mother, you gather your chickens under your wings. This dead chicken of yours puts himself under your wings. For by your gentleness, the badly frightened are comforted. By your sweet smell, the despairing are revived. Your warmth gives life to the dead. To you be blessing for ages and ages. Amen. I didn't want to end with stories or images of lament. I've been praying with St. Anselm and I've been talking to Bion. Yet the more I've tried to jiggle things around, the more I knew I was trying to turn away from the truth of our present reality. Truly, this is a time of lament. In this most tender image of our Mother God, we can see both the strength of kindness and the courage to grieve. If Luke, you could bring it up just briefly, it would be helpful. The same image. In this tender image, we can see both the strength of kindness and the courage to grieve. See how the chicks plus one rather large different bird, I think this is the included stranger, are clustering together in the dirt. They need to stay just there together for the time being within the orbit of the mother hen. She, in turn, is being held in the gaze of the mother God, in the crook of her body, curled in the same dirt. Yet there is no coercion here. When the time is right, you can see there is a way open for them. Though when that time comes, they will need, I think, to keep an eye on those two roosters we can just see strutting in the hills behind them. Thank you, Luke. And finally, the example of Angela Merkel. I want to offer another, perhaps more secular image of a mother who watches over us. One-time Mutti of Germany and the EU. Her example comforts me too. Her kindness had no sentimentality to it. She was methodical. She was a physicist, and this gave her a scientist's understanding of matter, which she used to make sense of the problems she faced in Germany and across the EU and the world. It helped her to break down problems into their component parts and then to see how they might be fitted back together differently and better. Her motto was, "In quietness and confidence shall be your strength." She endured patronizing misogyny from her colleagues without hysteria. She lived simply. She dressed boringly. Her private life was happy and private. She had no children of her own, yet millions called her Mutti. And when the Syrian crisis sent refugees pouring into Europe, she insisted Germany take a full share. She said, "If we do not welcome them, then this is not a country I can live in." So, in conclusion, the mystery of God in the power of redemptive relationships was the vision that Roy Bradley and Margaret lived their lives in and for. It was, they knew, best expressed in community. In other words, strangers were always to be welcomed. There was always to be a place for the outsider, literally in the flesh, and figuratively too, in the life of the mind. Like George Mung, Roy Bradley was a two-way man, a clever man for the dreaming. He and Margaret bridged theology and psychology and sociology with generous intelligence. It's this vision of what matters that I see being kept alive by the Centre for Spirituality of Care and Community. And I can now also see that those bereavement support groups at Peter Mac 30 years ago were in fact transient communities of redemptive relating. People lost in their separate griefs found common cause and community. "Because of you, my heart went back to its right place," one woman said to her whole group. Could it be then that some kind of transient bereavement support group communities may actually be one way for us who are carers and carers of carers to find for ourselves the strength of kindness and the courage to grieve, to allow us to keep going in this desolate time? We must listen. Behold and see if there be any sorrow like unto this sorrow. We must face and accept the reality of our big and little deaths and losses. We must experience the pain of our grief. Only then can we adjust to the environment in which the familiar safety of our worldview is no longer tenable. Only then might we discover that, as Ernst Becker argued, it is in fact possible, more possible than we dared imagine, to live and love with renewed freedom in the strength of kindness, understanding that the pain of grief is just as much a part of life as the joy of love. It is perhaps the price we pay for love, the cost of our commitment. I will give my last words to British psychiatrist Colin Murray Parkes. We are one people, one community, and the death of one is the concern of all. In the face of death, humankind can achieve grandeur. But if we turn our backs on death, we remain children, clinging to a land of make-believe. For death is not the ending of the pattern of life's unwinding, but a necessary interruption. Through the painful work of grieving, we rediscover the past and we weave it afresh into a new reality. Our aim cannot be to cancel out the past, to try to forget, but to ensure that the strength and meaning which gave beauty to the old pattern is remembered and reinterpreted in the pattern now emerging. Everyone must die, but the world is permanently changed by each person's existence. At the point of death, we meet the forces of social evolution. We may back away in fear. We may refuse the chance to change. We may drown our pain in drugs or alcohol or meaningless activity. Or we may accept the pains of grief and begin the long struggle to rediscover meaning in a life whose meanings can no longer be taken for granted. There is no easy way through the log valley, but we have faith in the ability of each one to find his or her own way, given time and the encouragement of the rest of us. May this be so. Amen.
Well, thank you, Linda. Thank you for sharing your really deep reflection with a warm wisdom. I'm so glad that we actually have a recording of this session, because I feel I have to go back and listen to it again and again. So we will have a recording to share. We now have 30 minutes of question and discussion. So please enter your questions or comments into with the Q&A button, which is on the bottom bar, slightly on the right. And while you're doing that, I would like to invite Bernadette Wolfman to start this segment with a response and a question.
Yes. Thank you, Eugen. And Linda, I feel as though you've just taken us on this wonderful and sacred journey. I feel like we've been given this wonderful mosaic of different pieces around the importance of kindness and the courage to grieve, and that you've really held us on a sacred journey of mystery and hopeful redemption. And I was really taken with as you opened up your talk on engaging with your 6-year-old granddaughter and her asking her why you're going to church, and your response was to ask God to keep showing us what matters, and part of your response to her also was because it's too easy to forget. And I was also taken with so many things, but I was also taken with your reference to sometimes people on the outside can see ways forward in extending kindness and the importance and value of grief. And for some of us who might claim to be Christian and compassionate and part of community, we can actually learn from them. And I wondered if you could make just a few more comments about that. Thank you.
Thank you. It is humbling, isn't it, to what comes out of our mouths about what we believe doesn't quite match up with how we behave. And the mercy of God is a constant need and a blessing to us in that. But what I've loved about my work at Peter Mac was that often I'd have people sent to me because I wasn't going to be a God botherer. And I sometimes felt quite badly about that. But I once took a funeral for a woman who came to me because I said she won't talk about God unless you want to. And she didn't. And then it was so helpful to her. She asked me to take her husband's funeral when he died. And so I got clever with, remarkable, found every prayer I could find that was sort of non-dogmatic. And she looked at them and she said, no, you promised, no God. So I made up a funeral with Shakespeare, basically, which was thank God for Shakespeare. But she took me out for lunch some month afterwards. It was a huge funeral. And while we were waiting for our meal, she shoved an envelope across the page of the table and she said, open it. And I opened it and I cried. And she said, what are you crying for? And this huge cheque fell out, made out. And the note said, I've made out this cheque for pastoral care, an area of the hospital not associated with treatments which can be often unsuccessful, but with compassion that never fails. And I start to weep. She said, why are you weeping? And I said, because you and I had a deal and I kept my side of it and you've just broken your side. Compassion that never fails is the only name I've got left for God after working in this place for, umpteen years. So I feel like, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I think the sort of kindness that comes is because, like Beyond, if we just listen and honour the depth of what is in a person, our words are often completely superfluous, and their kindness in forgiving us for rabbiting on is huge. What do they say? The noise always comes from the shallow end of the pool. The deeper you go into the mystery, the less words you need to use. And so kindness then shines without any doctrine attached to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, I would like to invite Jill Bradley who's moderating the question. I'd like to encourage people to ask, comment. This is very informal. And Jill will, whom you have contact with, will moderate and read out the questions for Linda.
Thank you, Eugen, and thank you from me, Linda, for a most wonderful reflection, certainly a mosaic, as Bernadette has described it. We have a few questions. So the first is from Shirley, just asking how the idea of keeping alive the memory and connection with the loved one fits with Warden's 4 tasks.
Yeah. Good question. I don't think Warden's asking us to forget. That would be cruel. But I think he is saying that if we cling, if we cling too tightly, it's hard for other people to love us. It's hard for us to be open to the possibility. And I think he's not saying to find another partner or, replace a child who's died. It's not about replacement, but it is about honouring and holding and treasuring without clinging. I think that's the best I can say to that. it would be cruel to be expected to forget. I don't think that's not what he would want, and not what any compassionate person who's got some idea of the attachment, the depth of love. You can't forget that, nor should you.
Thank you. And a question from me. I was really taken by your early sort of exploration of the need to experience sorrow to be able to experience kindness, but
Yes.
also our tendency to avoid pain, like as a. And I'm curious then about what is it that makes it so hard for some people to actually acknowledge the pain of others and to apologise? And I guess, you know, one key example would be how long it took for Conservative governments to actually apologise to Aboriginal people for, you know, all the pain and trauma that they experience.
I suppose, I think it might be something to do with Britishness, in a way that feelings are, certainly when I grew up, feelings were not easily expressed, and men particularly, we were not allowed to go to our grandfather's funeral as children. And the more I thought about that afterwards, I thought, they don't want us to cry, because if we cry, they won't be able to hold on to their tears. So I think it might be a great sorrow that sorrow is not in the vocabulary or the emotional vocabulary, or it's so pushed down that the sense of losing control, if I allowed it out, is I feel so happy when I see a man weeping. I think women perhaps find it easier, although there are a few stiff upper lip women in my life, I know. But I do think the experience of being sad and held makes it possible. But one of the things about Bion was he was the son of missionaries in India, and they brought him to England and put him in a boarding school at the age of 8. And he talks about watching his mother walk back down the drive and seeing her hat bobbing above the hedge and just feeling utterly desolate. And he said in chapel, those boys' favourite hymn was, "Art thou weary, art thou languid, art thou sore distressed?" And I thought, you know, that's a terrible. In fact, I've noticed that a lot of psychiatrists, you know, the psychiatrist school have come, some of those wonderful ones have come out of the British experience of the killing of emotion. So I suppose that's hard to unlearn. And then how do you say sorry for something if you can't actually feel the sorrow of it? It feels like nonsense. It feels like indulgence, like black armband version of history, indulgent. You know, get a grip. You know, we've all got to move on. Well, we would move on well. That makarata word in the statement of the heart is saying, let's walk together. Like, you could do both. You can weep and be strong. And I don't think if you've had that knocked out of you as a child, or, you know, by your society, by your culture, by your family history, you don't learn that easily.
Thank you, Linda. I have another question from Gwen Graham. And her question's about Warden's 4 points, including love again, not necessarily meaning a new partner. And there are 4 Greek words that describe the 4 kinds of love, but only one of them is eros.
Yeah.
The others are about friendship and compassion, etc. Just wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, and yes. Yes, yeah. Just the ability for us to be, I was talking to somebody recently who just said, I love watching how my children, teenagers and in their 20s, just say to one another, I love you, much more easily than we did when we were kids. Like, and I don't mean let's get into bed. I just mean you're beautiful and I love you. And it's easily said. It's very healthy. And that means, I suppose, that if you get to that fourth stage of mourning, you know, when you've lost whatever it is you've lost, if it's not an eros or a marital or a lifelong or a parental or child loss, if it's just a friend, it can be the deepest love that we ever know. So, you know, yeah, and all those forms of love are very important and to be treasured.
Thank you, Linda. It reminds me of a very dear friend of mine who lost a son to suicide not so long ago, and one of his reflections was that he now wanted to tell people that were special to him how much he loved them. So again, that for me a really lovely example of moving through those stages to be able to engage with life again. And
it makes me laugh. I've just remembered my last letter that I got from 6-year-old Mina. Written on the front of the envelope with the address, barely legible to the poor postie, was "Get ready for love." Written right across the envelope. I thought, oh, she's not going to have any problems. Well, maybe she is, but she's not going to find it hard to believe in love. She's ready in all sorts of ways.
And a response from Gwen to Linda. Thank you, Linda. English has only one word, love, that we use for ice cream, our best friend, and sunsets, etc. And a question from Rachel. Thank you for mentioning the person trying to channel God when they went out to meet chaplains. I'm a spiritual and pastoral care coordinator across 2 aged care facilities in Brisbane. I've volunteered in this area since 1987 when I started volunteering with the Queensland AIDS Council. But now with the impact of COVID, sometimes I do feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume and variety of little and large griefs these last couple of years. What do you recommend for frontliners at the moment? Thank you.
Whoa. It is really hard. And when I rang that friend who works in aged care and asked him, said I was doing this talk, and I said, well, what do you want me to say? What's it like being supervisor to all those centres? I think he gets exhausted and burnt out and has to be careful to know when he must have a break. So knowing that we're human and can't do more than we can do is essential, and therefore having our own containment and our own supervision and our own care is really, really important. And sometimes that's available and sometimes you have to look really hard to find it. But without that, it's impossible to do it. I don't have any clever ideas when the staff are not there, except to that thing of we are those are our values, and that's what we say that we will live by, and yet we are human, and we cannot do what is beyond us. And maybe just little breaks and forgiving ourselves for not being where we know we should be. I feel that's perhaps a poor answer, but I don't have another one. And maybe others in the audience do, and maybe there can be talk about that from people who are closer to this now than I am presently.
Yes, Rachel's response, Linda, is that she has her own excellent professional supervision, and
Good.
you know,
Good.
critical. Just wondering if there are any other questions. Julia's comment that astonished rising was a phrase that she loved.
Yes. Well, it does, doesn't it? I mean, you suddenly walk out one morning and you thought you couldn't cope or bear it anymore, and some unexpected act of kindness shifts it. The woman who wrote that poem, that marvelous poem on kindness, I listened to her online. She told a story about how she wrote that poem. She said, it just came to me. And she said the circumstances were, my husband and I were on our honeymoon, roughing it on a bus through South America. And all our families had said, don't do it. And we said, no, we'll do it. And within a couple of days, they'd been robbed of everything they had. And they were traveling, thin, light. She said, we didn't have anything. We'd lost our passports, we'd lost our money, we'd lost our clothes, we'd lost our food. And one poor old man on the bus was kind to us. And she said that made it possible for us to keep going. And she said, and then that poem just dropped out of the sky. All I had was my pad and my pencil. And that poem is what came to me. So it is, that astonished rising, it comes. And that's what Bion was on about, isn't it? That it comes from the same source. It isn't something we can manufacture.
Thank you. Linda, maybe we can wrap it up there, and I'll pass back to Eugen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Jill. And thanks everyone for your contribution, the questions. I'd like now to invite Bernadette to come back and perhaps with some closing remarks to finish off this segment.
Well, it's my pleasure, Linda, to say thank you so much for today, but not only for today and your presentation and all that you've offered us, but for the many hours of time in preparing today. I'm very aware that, this doesn't just happen, but you've put in a lot of research and all the resources that you've used are very rich. You mentioned that we're very good as human beings in avoiding, and we've got many opportunities to enter into that world of avoidance with apps and all sorts of other means to avoid. But today you've actually reminded us of how valuable it is to listen, to be still, to make use of the arts, our imagination, to enter into that spirit of being able to get in touch with our own sorrow, our own grief, so that we can be really present to other people. And so I'm sure we all go away just being reminded of that and not to dismiss it. Often it can be dismissed as not being very professional or, not being scientific enough, but it is so basic to our humanity and our spirituality. So thank you for offering us a wealth of wisdom and drawing on such richness across the centuries and from ancient times. And I believe we can go away today in hope, being reminded of how we can meet people as equals and with genuine humility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a privilege. It was hard work and it did take a lot of time, and I'm very, very glad I did it. So thank you for trusting me with it. It was an honour.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Bernadette, and thanks, Linda, again. There's so much food for thought that you've given us, and we, I think, as an organisation, would be interested to think about how we can continue this conversation, which in many ways just begun. So I'd like to thank you again, Linda, for myself. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, for coming today, and if you continue to express your interest, please register or let other people know of the work of the CSCC. And I think we have your email, and they will keep you informed. But if you have any query, please contact us. I'd like to thank Jill, Chu, and Luke for really holding the technical side. I'd like to apologize for my anxiety at the beginning. Perhaps there's unconscious wish not to be seen, but you don't need to be Sigmund Freud for that. But I thank you all for today, for the 4th Roy Bradley Oration, and perhaps we look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.